Ah, the Queen, the Queen, the Queen Aretha. Who wants to have Aretha Franklin as their chazan, right? Like that's a shul I'd go to. Welcome everybody. I'm so happy to see everybody. I'm so happy to be teaching again, starting a new, I don't know, what is it, a semester, year, fall, just like starting up learning again after the high holidays and then the sort of collapse after that I at least go through. Okay, and I'm so happy that we are beginning this exploration, that we're exploring this topic. Our topic is, in a word, tefillah. That's the Hebrew word, tefillah, and we're going to be looking a lot at that word tonight. We translate that as prayer. Of course, it's not a direct translation. That's part of what we're going to talk about tonight. But we're going to be talking about Jewish prayer, and the Jewish word for prayer is tefillah, and it's actually, I think, a very difficult topic. It's a very difficult activity, I think, and it's a kind of, I always think that Jewish prayer is a kind of a paradox. Like it's a series of contradictions, because it is at once the central activity in Jewish life, at least diasporic or at least American Jewish life, has been organized around synagogues. The rabbis said famously that after the temple was destroyed, that the place that we had, the little sanctuaries that we had, were batei knisiot and batei midrashot, the prayer houses and the study houses. But for them, it was like, it's almost surprising that they included prayer, because study was everything. But for us, the prayer houses, the Beit Knesset, which literally is the house of gathering, is the central building the central space in our Jewish lives. So it's funny because we're only now coming back into that space, and we've been talking about not being in communal space. Well, when we talk about that, we're talking about the synagogue, the shul, the Beit Knesset, which is literally, again, the house of gathering, which is to say, when we gather to pray. It is the central activity then in many ways in Jewish life, and also the least accessible activity in Jewish life. I mean, it's a dense tradition. It is hard to penetrate in many ways, but at least learning is kind of open to interpretation. At least when we study the Torah, we are usually doing it in the language that we speak, right? But prayer is dense and by tradition in Hebrew. We'll talk about that at some point. Does it have to be? And there's this freaking book. Rabbi Brous did this when she announced the class on Shabbat, and it's the right gesture. Like, you gotta, when you start the topic of prayer, we start thinking about how do we understand prayer. The first thing you do is, my God, we have a book that we carry around. What does prayer mean? Does it mean, it means for us opening a book and reading through hundreds of pages on Yom Kippur? It's like literally we read the whole book that day, and we don't know what we're reading. I mean, it's almost insanity. It's almost insanity. So it's a paradox in that way. It's also a paradox in that it is at once deeply personal. You're having like kind of an internal conversation, expressing the words that come out of your heart. And at the same time, it is, as we've been saying, the most communal thing. In fact, it's mandated to be communal. You're supposed to seek other people, a minyan famously, to pray. You don't need a minyan to learn. And of course, you don't need a minyan to pray, but we are encouraged to be with others in this activity, which is so personal. One of the great experiences I had over the pandemic is really coming to understand what it means to just pray alone. Just be alone and pray alone. And it was powerful, and also it felt lonely and something deep was missing because it's supposed to be, we're supposed to do this together. So that's a paradox. And finally, and I could keep going. I mean, there's all kinds of contradictions in prayer, but one of the central contradictions, I think, is one of the basic dilemmas in Jewish prayer is that it is at once a kind of raw crying out to God from the heart, something very natural and visceral. And then at the same time, it is Jewish prayer is extremely formal and ritualistic and scripted. You don't even say your own words. How could that be? How could that be? Okay, so we gotta figure out what to do with Jewish prayer. We gotta figure out what to do with this book, or whether we should be working with this book. I think that's a real question. And I come to you as someone who struggles with prayer myself. It's not my favorite part of Jewish life, partially because it is so dense. And I feel like if I pray 100 days, I don't know, if I have 5 of them are successful, that's a good track. I mean, it's hard. And now that I'm a shul rabbi, that I work in a community, suddenly it feels like, oh, but I have to figure this out. This is what we do. I kind of ignored it for many years. I just functioned as an educator, and we talk about other things. But now I really feel in a deep way that right after the Torah, if you're a shul rabbi, right after the Torah, this is maybe before the Torah, this is the book you're thinking about. This is the book that you're having to explain. And this is the book that people are asking about. And that's the main reason that I'm doing this class, is because you've been asking for it. It is the request I hear most often as someone who tries to hold the learning space for adults at Ikar. The thing that people are most often asking for help with, for understanding with, the place that they want to start is with prayer. And it's not necessarily because they are so into the idea of prayer, but because, again, that's what they encounter. That's what you encounter when you walk into a Jewish space. So how do you do it? What is it like? What does it do? And so for so many of us, and I have had this experience so many times myself, walking into a Jewish space is walking in, being handed a book, sitting down, and then having no idea what's going on for an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours, that whole day. You know, that's not what we want. We gotta get beyond that, whatever we do. So let's begin. Let's begin with a form of prayer. We'll talk about whether blessing and prayer are the same thing. We're going to talk about everything. And we're going to go very slowly. We're going to do this every week at 6 o'clock on Mondays, and we're going to go very slowly most of the time because it is such an important topic, and because we haven't taught a class on it before. I haven't taught a class on it before. I should say, just like I have taught a class on prayer before. I taught a couple of prayer series for the Wexner Foundation, which is like big leagues if you're a Jewish teacher. So like I have some experience doing it. I'm not just like coming like, what? I have thought about this, but I struggle with it. And I was saying we're going to go slowly, and what we've done before is to do a crash course. And I have had a couple of experiences which are like valuable, but also not so valuable, of just shouting all the information I can at you for 2 hours straight, a prayer boot camp, we called it. That's good, but like that's not going to be our pace in this class. We're going to go really slowly. Okay, so let's begin with a form of prayer. Let's begin with a blessing. We will explore the act of blessing in great detail, but one of the blessings that we say is to bless this space, to bless this activity of gathering together to think and to reflect and to study. So we'll say the blessing over Torah study, which ends La'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. All right. So just one more note of introduction before we kind of dive in today. And we're going to try and keep this to an hour. I really feel like, especially online, we gotta stick to an hour, and I'm already a fourth of the way through. So one more note of introduction, which is that I was trying to think out what to call this class, and I wanted to call it like How to Pray Jewishly, because I just thought that was cute. And then I thought, oh, I should be more precise in communicating what it is. So I wanted to call it Jewish Prayer in Theory and Practice, by which I meant to say that what I want to do, here is both to really give over, together kind of clarify the technical aspects of Jewish prayer. That's the practice, the skills. Hopefully in every one of these classes, you'll be leaving with some prayer skills, and that's important. And that in some ways maybe is our most essential goal. But theory and practice, I also want to talk about and Andrea, who is, running our show tonight, runs just about everything that I do. So thanks to Andrea tonight. Andrea was like, well, theory and practice doesn't sound it's not so sexy. So, or so accessible, right? We're like dealing with inaccessibility. So we're calling this prayer the hows and whys of Jewish prayer. And the how is the skills, and the why is, what is it? What are we trying to do here? And that brings us into theology. And so this is a space, and one of the reasons, even though I don't always love doing prayer, I love teaching prayer. One of the reasons I love teaching prayer is that we're going to talk about God. We have to talk about God. We have to figure out, what are we praying to? Are we praying to something? What is it out there? Do we have to know? Okay, so those questions also will be with us always. And in some weeks, we'll do a little more philosophy, theology, and some weeks we'll do a little more halakha, law, ritual, technical skills. But hopefully there'll be a little of both every time. Okay, so today I said we're going to go slow, and today we're gonna be like only going to be looking at one word basically, and that is the word tefillah. I think that's where we start. We are in a linguistic tradition. We're in God creates the world with speech. So it defines our languages. Our theology starts in language, in words. And so we're going to look at the word tefillah, because we have translated it as prayer, but that comes from the Latin. Right? What is tefillah? What is that word? What does it mean? Or to pray in the verb form, lehitpalel, and that we have to think about also. Okay, so what do I do when I want to kind of really figure out what does this word mean in its own context, in Jewish context? What do I do? The technique when I'm studying Torah, and in a way when I'm studying any concept in our tradition, is I go back to the first usage. What is the first usage? And then do some comparison. But where does this concept appear? Where does it emerge in our tradition? And does anyone know? This is like a little guess, but where the first usage of tefillah, of prayer, lehitpalel? It would be quite a grab. That's just a pop quiz. So, but the first usage is in a story that we've been in now for a few weeks. So we're right in on schedule. A first usage is with Abraham.
Yeah.
With Abraham. Is that what you're going to say, Leah?
I was going to say, isn't it with Abraham's manservant who he's sent to find Rebecca, but he doesn't know it's Rebecca, and he hopes she's the right one, the woman at the well.
Yeah. He offers a prayer there. Abraham's servant offers a prayer there, though I don't believe it's named as a prayer. So again, just looking at the word tefillah, it's a little earlier. So the story is actually like we could spend an hour just talking about this story because it's such a weird and disturbing story, but it's the story of Abraham going down to Egypt and telling Sarah to tell people that she is his sister so that he won't get killed, because he worries that people will kill him and take Sarah if they know that she is his wife. The problem, and the reason it's disturbing, is because it seems like the alternative is they'll take her and they won't kill him. So he hasn't avoided that problem. He's just saved his own hide. So that's that's a whole dilemma in itself. Nachmanides says, I feel like it's important to mention, Nachmanides says that Abraham sinned greatly when he did this, but we'll leave that aside for today, because the prayer that emerges comes after the fact, because Abraham goes down, and indeed the local king Avimelech does see Sarah and abduct her, and then that's where we enter. Then God speaks to Avimelech in a dream. Okay. And God is actually the first to articulate the word for prayer, litpalel, but does it sort of in reference to Abraham. So let's take a look. And what we're going to do with these texts is we're going to try to interpret their meaning in their context. And I think this first one will be very very clarifying for us immediately. And in some ways, just because of the way that it's translated, you'll see the word used here twice in quick succession, and it's translated, I just left the Sefaria translation, it's translated differently in the first and second, but same word. So that we begin to have once it's translated as prayer, but as you'll see, it's also translated otherwise. So let's take a look. Okay, here we go. So God said to Avimelech in the dream. Remember, Avimelech now has Sarah held hostage, and God is coming to her rescue because after all, Abraham didn't. So God said to Avimelech in the dream, I know that you did this with a blameless heart. I don't know how exactly he abducted a woman, so I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I know that I think it seems to be a reference to the fact that you don't know that she's married, right? Just like it is a sin to sleep with a married woman, so I guess it's also like related. It's a sin to abduct a married woman more so than an unmarried woman. Okay, I know you did this with a blame heart, so I kept you from sinning against me. That was why I did not let you touch her. Okay, so it seems from the narrative that Sarah was not actually physically molested, though she was physically abducted. Now, return the man's wife. And here it is. And since he is a prophet, kinavihu, he will intercede on your behalf. Vaitpalel ba'adcha, to save your life. Vechiyeh. Okay, he will intercede on your behalf. That's the way Sefaria translates it, and that's the word that we're gonna start thinking about. Interceding on your behalf. So he will intercede on your behalf to save your life. If you fail to return her, know that you shall die, you and all that are yours. Okay, so it seems that Avimelech has to return Sarah, but that's not enough. He will also need Abraham to be mitpalel, what we would usually translate as to pray, but here to intercede, and it's very specifically ba'adcha, on your behalf. And I wanted to just show you one more thing before I open up the conversation. I wanted to show you one more thing, which is just, you should know that you can do this on Sefaria. This is a great website, sefaria.org, has most of the classic Jewish texts on it. And I've put together this source sheet, but just to show you a little bit how it's used, you can click on the source and it'll just open it. And I want to do that because once you're in not a source sheet, but a regular page in Sefaria, one of the things you can do is you can select a word. This is the word, he will intercede, and there it is, v'yitpalel, v'yitpalel, and you can actually click on that word. And then it'll show it has a dictionary definition. Okay, so this is part of what we need to do here. We need to always, when we're studying Jewish Hebrew words, we need to go to the root and look at what is the root, because every Hebrew word has, or most Hebrew words have a 3-letter root, which is their core meaning. So we need to understand the root, and we need to understand the form that the root is in, and that'll help us to get a sense of what. But let's start with the root here. Okay, so we had just clicked in, and you see that palal, from whence tefillah or litpalel comes from, is indeed to intervene or interpose, less used word, or to pray, right? Sometimes we translate it as to pray. And look, it's also to mediate or to judge. Now that's an interesting word there, to judge. So, and that is because the word does have a kind of a legal or a judicial almost connotation. In modern Hebrew, we speak of criminal acts as plili. Criminal is plili, same language there. Okay, but that's a step forward, right? In the biblical, it is somehow to intercede or to judge or to seek judgment. Okay, so now, and I'll just show you one more thing, which is that it translated as to intercede, vayitpalel, and I said vayitpalel, but it's actually vayitpalel. And he will, right? That's the difference between the future and past tense for those paying attention. He will intercede on your behalf. And then, so Avimelech returns Sarah, but he actually blames Abraham, which, he might rightly do, although both of them are operating in this sort of bizarre patriarchal logic of like, oh, you didn't tell me she was she wasn't really your sister. And Abraham says, well, she's sort of my sister. And, it's all very weird. But for our purpose, there at the bottom, Avimelech returns Sarah and also seems to pay a fine, some kind of fee as compensation. And then it says that Abraham then prayed. Vayitpalel. Now it's Vayitpalel, and that flips it to the past. Abraham then prayed, but basically the same word there, to God. Vayitpalel Avram el ha-Elohim. And that, of course, is important, to God. And it'll be important for us also to note what happens. God healed Avimelech and his wife and his maidservants so that they bore children. God had closed up all, had said, because you did this, you were going to sleep with someone that you shouldn't. I'm going to make it so that none of you can conceive when you sleep together again. And Abraham prays on or intercedes on Avimelech's behalf and prays to God, and it works. So now, okay, what is prayer? Or what is Jewish prayer? Or what does it mean to say that Jewish prayer is a kind of interceding, a kind of mediating, a kind of seeking of judgment? What does it mean to say that prayer is mediation, or prayer is intercession? What is that? What is that? What is that prayer? It sounds legal, right? As I said. So what does it mean to say that that's prayer? So let's start with Hal and or Kathy.
Well, I mean, I think in this case, it's you're asking for something. It's petitionary. You are praying for some action or some consideration. So it is kind of legal.
Great. Okay. So Hal's doing great work for us. Exactly the kind of work we should do. Let's try to figure out from this context, what are all the things that we are learning about prayer? One is that it seems to be in its earliest form about request, seeking something. You're asking for something, right? That's not the only thing nowadays we would say that prayer is, to request, but it is one of the hallmarks of Jewish prayer. And yes, we see that here. What else? What else do we see here? And in order to spark, I might say, who is praying to whom, on behalf of whom, asking for what for whom, right? Like, think about all the parties, the subjects and the objects here. Judy, I saw you raise a hand.
I was thinking that it's the mediator between myself and God. The act of prayer is the mediator.
Okay, that's good.
Is the content.
That's good. So prayer, Judy's already kind of jumping a step ahead and saying, oh, maybe prayer, then whatever happens in prayer will serve as a kind of mediating act between me, the prayer, and God. But it isn't in this case. right? In this case, Abraham is asking from God for Avimelech. Okay? Note that, because for a while, it seems to be that that's what tefillah is. Now, as I said, you might say, Leah was quite right to say that we see other people praying. I was reading up today, preparing for this, and saw someone suggest that the first prayer is offered by Cain. Cain, who says, "My gadol chatai milinsoy, my sin is too great to bear." Maybe just talking to God is prayer. Maybe we see things that we would call prayer all over the Torah, but the language of tefillah, of lihitpalel, seems to be someone asking for something on someone else's behalf. And that seems to hold for a while. The word won't be used too many more times in the Torah, but Moses will pray. And of course, Moses is mitpalel on behalf of the children of Israel. So now that's interesting. Imagine, prayer starts in our tradition as an act that you don't do for yourself. You do for someone else. You pray, you try to you're the mediator. So that's interesting. Okay, Judith.
Yeah, hi. So it kind of strikes me interesting, the definition of the word also meaning judge. And so it reminded me that prayer is basically, a two-way street. There's two sides. There's the person asking for intercession or submitting a request, but then God has to judge whether or not they're going to grant it, and in particular in the passage that you read, where that word, I can't pronounce it, that means intervention.
Oh yeah, Lit Hallel.
Yeah, Elit Hallel, when that sentence, and it said something about, I'll grant you life or let you live or something like that. And I thought, well, that's a judgment. I'm going to judge. Like judge might have been the better word than prayer, kind of in that sentence, determining who lives or whatever. But yeah, and I don't think it's always like in this particular case, it's Abraham requesting something on behalf of Avimelech, but later on, Hannah, prays for herself, to have a child, and
okay, great. Yeah, so I'm only cutting you off because you're heading exactly the right direction. That's where we're heading next. So let me just pause you there. Now, right, you've signaled where we're very wisely where we're going, and you also described very beautifully the whole scene here. And you return us to this kind of courtroom language, and it is very much there's a trial. You're requesting, as Hal said, but part of the process of prayer, the act of prayer, it depends on the judge, and God is the judge. In this activity, we are addressing God as the judge, and so we are waiting for a verdict, and that's part of what is your prayer successful? We don't usually talk about like successful prayers, but in this case, it is. Did the prayer work? And we know, what is it that will make the prayer work in Abraham's case? He's a prophet, right? It says ki navihu, he's a prophet, and so his prayer might work. Now that's interesting, because now also prayer sounds like you need a lawyer for prayer. Well, you need a prophet, but you need someone. It isn't just that it is an act where someone acts as a third party interceding between God and someone else, but also it has to be like a lawyer. It has to be an expert who knows how to pray. And that feels almost like prayer, or at least tefillah, is not something that everyone can do. And so again, Moses will pray on behalf of the people. It seems like maybe the people can't pray in this particular kind of context, can't pray on their own behalf. Okay. I think I saw one other hand out there, but maybe it was withdrawn. Let's see. Yeah, Joe.
Just one other thought along the intercession line is, liturgically at least, we collectively pray for the people Israel in many of the prayers in the liturgy. So I think that tradition kind of continues, or at least maybe the rabbis wrote that into the liturgy. I mean, we always end prayers with Oseh Shalom B'Mamav, things that are always collectively for the people Israel, for example.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Joe, because you're doing the work that we need to, that I'm hoping we will do often in this class, which is to think, okay, if these are the roots of one stream of Jewish prayer, how do we see that play out? And our high holiday liturgy is full of legalistic terminology and description and context. But as Joe says all the time, we are praying on behalf of the people of Israel, or on behalf of the sick, or on behalf of someone else who needs our prayers. So that idea that one of the central acts of prayer is to pray on someone else's behalf, that's foundational, to say the least. Okay. Let me turn to Alexandra, who has I know reflected a lot on this process.
So I thank you for the class. I think that perhaps the reason why it was so important that Abraham's prayers are so important to Avimelech are not because he is a prophet and is knows how to pray necessarily, but because he has I learned a teaching once that the more someone seeks to connect to God and the more you seek to develop your relationship with God, the more God and the more you love God and the more you allow God to love you, the more that your prayers are listened to and answered, because God wants to do everything to make you happy when you want to do everything to be your own most divinely connected person. And so I think that perhaps not because he knew how to pray or knew the laws or the rituals or anything like that, but because he worked at this connection with God.
Great. Thank you for that. That's a very, very helpful framing, because Alexandra's exactly right. We are speaking in some kind of legalese, and we're thinking about a prayer that seems kind of removed, third party, we just said. But, it isn't just that Abraham is elite or that he's a prophet, but that, as Alexandra says, we have arrived already at some notion that prayer is connecting to God. And Abraham has a special relationship with God. And so part of what we see is that to pray effectively is to be in real connection with God, real communion with God. And it may be for all these very particular and, intercession, that's the origins of Jewish prayer. That may be, it's sort of surprising to me, but it still does presume a connection. Okay, so that's important too. All right, let me take two more comments from Florine and Jen, and then we're gonna look at our next, we're gonna go where Judith was pointing us earlier. Florine?
I'm having trouble with the Hebrew here. If the "the" means "and" or it's used to nullify present or past tense, but hitpavel, doesn't that mean upon oneself? So my point then is there's another dimension that we haven't talked about in these so-called negotiations. The first point is to negotiate with oneself.
Good. Florine, ever sensitive to the nuances of language, and is exactly right. Prayer, the verb, is so interestingly in the hitpael, the reflexive tense. Now, I thought about, as I was preparing this, I was like, okay, how am I going to explain the reflexive tense? And it means it's reflexive, meaning back on oneself, but sometimes it also describes like a process in being. Now we're talking grammar. How can I squeeze that into? And then I realized, I'll just look it up on the internet, and I'll show you an internet page, a Wikipedia page that does this very, very well. So take a look at this. So Florine is right. Lihit, you might think that the verb would be lifalel, to intercede, right? But it's lihitpalel, reflexive. And the and this will take us to the next question, which Florine is already beginning to answer, which is, what does it mean though to just be in a process of praying for oneself, to intercede for oneself? What is that? So let's just like take a look at, just so we have it's hard when we're using Hebrew and and speaking about the grammar of Hebrew. It's hard to let's see if I can. Ooh, I'm having a trouble moving my. Here it is. So here's the reflexive verb. So the reflexive verb in the Hebrew. Let's just down in the Hebrew. It is this part right here. Just this part here added to a verb. Lehit palel, lehit pater. Now, the reflexive verb shows that often that one is doing it to oneself. It reflects back on you, right? Or turns back on you. So, for example, lifater might be to fire someone, but lehit pater is to resign. These are great examples that they give here. Limkor is to sell, but lehit maker is to kind of sell oneself, to get oneself sold on drugs, to get addicted, right? Lehit kaleach is fairly straightforward, to shower oneself, which in some languages you say to, we like to shower oneself, to take a shower, but lehit kaleach is to shower oneself. Lehistaper, to get a haircut, to have haircutting done on oneself, right? Now, it's not always so hard and fast how this works, because you might think that lehistaper means you have to actually do the haircutting, and it doesn't always work exactly that way, but there is some sort of turning into oneself that is implied by the verb. And that's of course, going to be very, very important. So thank you for that, Florine. We'll see how that works soon. But let's hear one more thought on where we're at from Jen Snow. Jen, you with us? I see that you are frozen, and I'm not sure if that's your icon or your self. Huh? Okay. We'll hold on Jen for now. Okay. But that's fine. We're perfectly well set up, I think, to head where Judith was taking us earlier. And Judith is exactly right, because we have now come to understand the way that lehit palel, this reflexive verb, is most often used in the Torah. I would say always used in the Torah, I think, which is someone praying on someone else's behalf. But that changes. And it isn't used very often in the Torah, I must say, this language, but it changes in the book of Samuel, and it is largely the work of one person who really becomes the paragon of Jewish prayer, the person who defines Jewish prayer for us. In other words, there is an earlier tradition of interceding, and that being the primary form of Jewish prayer, but someone changes that. And the person who changes that is Hannah, who in the first chapter of the book of Samuel begins a prayer that will shape the rest of the history of Jewish prayer. So important that we take a look at it tonight. Now, just a little bit of background. Hannah is married to Elkanah, and they seem to get along well. He loves her very much, but there's drama because he has another wife, Peninnah, and Peninnah has children and also seems to lord it over Hannah. And Hannah is as many of the great matriarchs in the tradition. It's a theme in our tradition. Hannah is unable to conceive, and Hannah and Elkanah, I should say, are together unable to conceive. And Hannah is, as we'll soon see, bitter about it. And that's the word that's used. So let's now take a look at this is a foundational text in so many ways, as we'll soon see, for Jewish prayer. And we are not losing the intercession connotation, but moving away from that kind of third-party prayer, because it is quite clear that Hannah is praying for herself. Okay? So let's take a look. Back at when I'm like hesitating here, it's because I'm moving my little, you know how Zoom works, my little bar, my little black bar. Okay, here we are back in Jewish prayer. Now I have to move back. Okay. Okay, Shmuel Aleph. She was a bitter soul. Vihi marat nefesh. In the translation I had was, in her wretchedness, she prayed, which is a good and poetic translation, but I want you really to feel the Hebrew here. Vihi marat nefesh. She was bitter of soul. She was deeply bitter of soul. And that, I mean, I want to just, in a sense, stop there. She was bitter of soul and she prayed. That's you know, we're like noting things in their context and what does that mean for prayer? That's one thing we have to note, is that the most classic of Jewish prayers emerged from a bitter soul, from wretchedness. Okay, and she prays, and it's the same word, but it's different now. Vatit palel el Adonai, and she prayed to the Eternal, and then listen to this, uvachotivke, and she was weeping all the while. She cried and cried. Think about that as well, right? Every little, we will soon see the rabbis pour through this text. Every little detail, every turn of phrase is so important because Hannah seems to be doing something that is paradigm breaking, okay? So she was bitter of soul and she prayed to God and she cried and cried and cried. And she made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant, ba'oni, the suffering of your maidservant. That's the same word that we use for the suffering in Egypt, the oni of your maidservant, and will remember me and not forget your maidservant. And if you, and you, and you, and you, we address God in prayer as the you, the thou. And if you will grant your maidservant a male child, I will dedicate him to the Eternal for all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head. Okay, now this is, she's part of what we're setting up here is the birth of Samuel, the great prophet, who she's, you know, a priori designating to the temple. Okay, as she kept on praying, and there's that word again, she kept on praying before the Eternal. Eli watched her mouth. Eli watched her mouth. Now, this is all going to be important, so pay attention. Now, Hannah was praying in her heart. Only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. It's a famous scene, probably many of you. And we read this every year on Rosh Hashanah, right? So probably many of you have seen this before. And he thought she was drunk, and Eli said to her, how long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Right? Ad matai tishtakarin. Remove your wine from yourself, sober up. But Hannah replied, now this is such a powerful moment. And of course, we have to note that this is a woman, and this is the high priest. And he's accusing her of being a drunk. And she replies and she says, no. Oh no, you've got it wrong. I am a very unhappy woman. I am a very unhappy woman. And that again is a kind of poetic translation. Ishak shat ruach anochi. A woman of difficult spirit am I. I have a hard spirit flowing through me. I have drunk no wine or other strong drink. I haven't done that. I have been pouring out my heart to the Eternal. And she's clever here. There's a play on the language that works in the English as well. I didn't drink wine. I was pouring out, not wine, but my heart. My heart. And that language, we saw that before. That she prayed, where is it? Prayed upon her heart, pouring out my heart. I'm going to find it, but praying out my heart to the Eternal. Do not take your maidservant for a worthless woman. I have only been speaking all of this time out of my great anguish and anger. V'ka'asi, my anger. There's so much here. There's so much here. Oh, there's the praying. Now, Hannah was praying in her heart. Okay, so the heart language is all, I was looking for that a second ago. Hannah was praying in her heart, al liba. Okay, Do not take your maidservant for a worthless woman. I have only been speaking all this time out of my great anguish and anger. Imagine that. Angry at God is totally legitimate, total and foundational. It's what it means to pray almost. And what does Eli, the high priest, say to this woman that just a second ago he thought was a drunkard? Lechi l'shalom. Then go in peace, said Eli, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked. Now, I feel emotional just reading it. And this is like, this in some ways, I'll begin by saying part of what's distinct about this is how emotional it is. Was Abraham's prayer emotional? It didn't seem like it. Just like, okay, yeah, I'll do it. Thanks for returning my wife. Yep, I'm a prophet. So emotional. Okay, but let's open. What else do we notice about this? I see Susan's got a hand up, or Marvin's got a hand up.
The sentence actually says "Vatispalel al Adonai," not El Adonai, and that seems slightly different than, and it's put together, with I don't know what it is, but it's it's linked, and I was wondering if there was any significance to that.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I happen to have talked about that this Rosh Hashanah, so I happen to be prepared for that question. Right. That's this language here, you're quite right, is distinct. It doesn't say that she prayed to the eternal, but on al. Sure. Okay. But al Adonai, right? Which means she prayed upon the eternal. And later, by the way, also, she wasn't praying really in her heart, but al, same word there, al liba. Now, what that could mean, let's just think about the language there. Could it be that we pray not only to God, but about God? I'm praying on God. I'm trying to figure out what God is. I'm praying on that, right? Or I'm praying on my heart. I'm trying to figure out what's in my heart. Like there is a nuance there that I think you're exactly right. Is very important here. All right, let's keep going. Allison.
Hey, thanks again for this class.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I'm reflecting on, there was this moment early on in the pandemic when my mom was really sick. And you and I talked on the phone, and you said something about prayer that really stuck with me. You said that because it was difficult, she was really sick and I couldn't travel because my parents are in Canada. And you said that sometimes prayer is a really great way of doing something and doing nothing at the same time. And that really helped me. And I'm thinking about that as we're studying this because, like Hannah probably felt so powerless, like as a woman, especially in that time, so much of your value is linked to having children. And she was probably really trying and just failing. And I think, like in that moment, like I so badly wanted to do something and there was like nothing to do. And being able to pray was so helpful. It was like, here's a thing that you can do.
Wow. I sound so wise. That I don't remember saying that because it came, that came out in our conversation. Like that wisdom emerged from what we were proud. You're as responsible for it as I am. So thank you for sharing that again, for remembering that. Yeah, think about, and I love the way you were speaking about the ability to summon something to do when there is nothing to do is an incredibly powerful act. And there's some kind of power that Hannah is finding here that we would just assume she doesn't have, right? For all the reasons you mentioned, and I'll add one. Where is she doing this? Where is she doing this? At the temple. At the great temple hasn't been built, but the temple at Shiloh, the central place of worship. And what did they do at the temple? What did Eli do? They burned sacrifices. That's our system. Pay attention to this. We will return to it again and again and again. There's something incredibly radical, revolutionary about what Hannah is doing in this moment. She goes to the place where they offer the animals on the altar, but she just talks to God. She just kneels down. I'm imagining her kneeling down, sitting down, right? She's wretched. She just talks to God. That's a move. That's quite a move. That's a huge move in our tradition, right? And it does, as she summoned that's something to do, that power, so she gives it to all of us. Now we always have prayer because you don't need a temple and you don't need a building. And that's going to become very, very important. We'll look at this next time when the temple is destroyed. Okay, let's take another comment from Payam.
Yeah, I mean, you said what I think I was going to say. I just wanted to, I mean, how radical this is, because all the mechanisms that were there previously for Abraham are still there. I mean, Eli is technically a prophet. She could have, if she just followed the Abrahamic model, she should have just gone to him and had him intercede in her behalf. But she didn't do that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's a lot more. And I always wondered, like, how did she even know how to do this? You know, like, is she the first to do it, or is it a practice? I mean, I think it's almost like she's the first one to be that kind of person, and just break the whole thing and do it this way.
You're exactly right. It's a total paradigm shift. And how did she know? How did she know that you could pray for yourself? Or as Florine put it, to intercede, right? Because that usage is still there. It's there deliberately. She intercedes on behalf of herself, right? She becomes her own lawyer. Like, it's changed a lot, right? It's much more emotional. It's much more, it's changed in many ways, but it retains that language of tefillah, which is she's approaching the judge and saying, give me good verdict. And I am asking this on behalf of you. And that's the way Eli understands it as well. May God grant you what you have interceded on behalf of yourself. So what does that mean? To mediate between God and yourself. To mediate between God and yourself. As if you reflect back on yourself and you think about, on your heart, what do you need? And then you turn to God and you say, hey, this is what I need. As if the praying self is an emissary of the suffering self. What a thought. What a thought. Okay. I want to do, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to do one important thing before we close. Now, I need another hour to move through this text, and we don't have it, so we'll just read through it. But what I do want you to see is just how important this text is, and the way that, as I said, the rabbis comb through it, looking for hints. How do we pray? How do we pray? How do we pray? Right? The why and the how. So here comes the how, and you begin to see here how just the beginning of how Jewish prayer as we know it is formulated. And this is the core text. Chana is the core text. And this is how the rabbis work with the Chana text. And you'll start to see in this text so many of the familiar images and practices in Jewish prayer that are drawn from Chana's prayer. Okay, so let's take a look here, because I just want to see this action at work. So here in the Talmud, in Brachot, first tractate of the Talmud, Rav Hamnuna says, how many, and he means it like an exclamation, wow, how many hilchata gebarvota, how many important halachot can be derived from these verses from Chana? Well, and Hannah spoke in her heart, or on her heart, as Marvin said, we learned that one who prays must direct their heart. Huge word in Jewish prayer, kavanah, sheyichaven, to direct the heart. We're going to have to spend an entire class talking about that. What does it mean to direct the heart? But we don't have time today. From only her lips moved, we learned that one who prays must enunciate the words with their lips. You know, why do you see Jewish people praying like, you actually have to, you can't just think them. Why? Okay, so we need another hour for that. But you can't just think them. You have to articulate, enunciate them. And then related, and her voice could not be heard, that one is forbidden to raise their voice in prayer. Now that sounds a little odd, but here in the context, what they mean is, and the asterisk is the Amidah, the silent prayer. Okay, so and that's the way we do it, You speak so that only you can hear. What is it? What a profound thing, as we come to our close, what a profound thing to think about the prayer that you must gather with other people to do, that you must say in a voice that only you can hear. There's so much in there. There's so much going on there. And finally, and this is important as well, though it seems like a kind of a funny afterthought, but it's important. So Eli thought she was drunk. We learned that a drunk person is forbidden to pray, or more to the point that you are forbidden to pray when you are drunk. Why? Or high, or, aren't there substances that might elevate our prayers, right? But yet tradition wants a clear-headed for some reason, or a clear heart for some reason. What is that about? Okay, all right, let's take, that's sort of where we're leaving off. Let's take one last comment from Kathy, and then we'll close. I want to just close with a final prayer. Kathy?
Yeah, well, this actually fits into the list, but it's not on the list. I'm really struck that she came with this bitter soul and that she was so angry. And it's just sort of a little counterintuitive because, especially when prayers are petitionary, you would think that that's not a good strategy, to be bitter and angry. That you try to kind of play nice or think that you're deserving or something like that. But I'm really moved by the fact that this is really it. This is really what she's feeling. It's not, oh, this is my strategy for getting what I want, in terms of a petition or a contract or the kind of legal thing. You wouldn't help you in a court. But in this situation, it's like if she's bitter and angry directly at God, then that must be really where she is, that's her, her deepest feelings. And so I'm really, yeah.
So well said. Prayer is honest. Prayer asks us to come with our true selves, to really show up, to really say, I'm angry at you. I don't know if I believe in you. I'm miserable. I hate this. I'm frustrated. I'm bored. I'm like, to really show up with your real self and to be in dialogue with God around that. What a thing. I want to leave us tonight. We don't have time to do this, and maybe in another session we'll look at it further. But someone was just asking me the other day, where do I start? How do I start Jewish prayer? And I was like, well, blessings are great, the little blessings that you say, but I think that's an incredible beginning practice, like say a blessing before it eats. But again, is that technically Jewish prayer? Prayer, blessings, we'll talk about that. Another thing I said was the Shema, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about. That might be the most famous of Jewish liturgy, Shema, the actual. But the other thing I said, and maybe the best way to start is with the start of your day with Modeh Ani or Moda'ani, right? And that prayer, I just want to look at it briefly before we close tonight, just because given everything that we've been saying, I think it allows us to see this prayer, which is a prayer of gratitude and a great way to start the day. Like this is, I recommended it because if you haven't begun experimenting with Jewish prayer, a great way to start is when you open your eyes in the morning, just saying thank you. Modeh Ani, Moda'ani, Modah is the feminine, right? So Modeh Ani or Moda'ani, I give thanks to you. But listen to the language in the context of what we've been saying tonight. Moda'ani, I am the one who gives thanks to you, right? I give thanks to you, living and everlasting King, right? The King, the one who might rule in judgment or issue some sort of pardon or favor. For you have restored my soul with mercy. Rabbi Munatecha. Great is your faithfulness. Shechazarta bi nishmati bechemla Rabbi Munatecha. This is a great first prayer to start with. But I want to just like end with it tonight because there is something about this idea of the person who intercedes on behalf of themselves. I am the one who communicates to God. I look and I regard myself and I say, oh, I'm alive again. And so, God, I want you to know that I offer you my gratitude. There's a self who is praying and a self who is acting, and then a self who turns back and regards the self, looks at self, considers the self. That modeh ani. I acknowledge myself in prayer as much as I acknowledge God. That's part of the dynamic that I have to be engaged in. And that's why that intercession, that mediation is so important. I'm working out the relationship between myself and my God. And that means I have to think about what or who my God is. But it also means that in order to pray, as Kathy was just saying, I have to really know who I am. I have to figure out who I am. Who is the self that prays? And then I have to bring that self, or I have to communicate that self, right? I have to give that self over to God, or transmit that self over to God. And that's just a part of what the act of prayer is. There's so much more. We're going to see so much more. We are over time tonight, but I will just say before we close that someone asked me, and this is a very good question, about what sidurim. I don't think I've even used that word tonight. Sidur is our, if tefillah is the word for Jewish prayer, Sidur is the word for the Jewish prayer book. And I just want to show you three and then give you a link to the Sidurim that you're not obligated to buy, but are Sidurim that we'll be making reference to, and so good ones to have. We'll often just use these sources on Safaria, so you'll have those. But obviously, this is an Ikar class, so we're going to use the Sidurim that we use at Ikar. That's the helpful thing. What are the page numbers? What are the, so knowing your way around this weekday Sidur, which is the Sim Shalom, and this Shabbat Sidur, which is the Lev Shalem. And so these are Lev Shalem is Shabbat. This is the one we probably, in fact, get asked about or use most often because Shabbat is such a, and then Sim Shalom during the week. And I just want to give you, before we finish, a link to, you can get these things online. So that may be helpful to you. And I think you may have to pay a subscription, or it may still be, it was free during the pandemic, but it may not be anymore. And the last, this one is great. It's a classic. This one is good too, a little clunky sometimes, but good. But this, I want to say, is a masterpiece. This is Jonathan Sachs's translation and commentary it's called the Koren Sachs Sidur. And I think it's one of the great Sidurim to have been put together in our age by the great Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, who died recently. So this is also just in terms of like just reading his introduction, reading his commentary. I recommend this one to you all. There are thousands. There must be hundreds of thousands. I don't know, tens of thousands of Sidurim. So there's a lot out there, but those are the ones I recommend. All right, everyone. Let's wrap up for the night. We will try to keep this to an hour. I'm excited to begin. I need this as much as anyone here does. I need to figure this stuff out for myself. So hopefully we, and in our theme, right? Somehow we need each other to figure out ourselves. That's part of what Jewish prayer is saying. So thank you. See you next week. Looking forward to this journey with you. Good night.
Thank you,